There was a sealed box sitting on my belt at Register 4, and I was not going to scan it. My hand would not move toward the scanner, no matter how many times I told it to. The customer buying it started tapping her card against the counter, annoyed, then confused, then a little embarrassed for me. The line behind her kept growing. Somebody near the back called out, asking what the holdup was. My manager walked over, saw a sealed box sitting there untouched, and asked me what exactly I thought I was doing. I told her I could not scan it. She told me to scan it anyway, or she would write me up on the spot. I looked at that box one more time, looked at her, and said, no. She fired me right there, at my own register, with 11 people standing in that line watching every second of it. Half of them thought I had lost my mind. I could hear it in the way they were talking to each other. I did not care. I still did not scan that box. Before I keep going, I want to say something to whoever is watching this. If you have ever noticed something nobody else could see and had to decide whether it was worth losing everything to say something about it, this channel is for you. I put up a story like this every week about ordinary people who paid a real price for trusting what they knew before anyone else believed them. If that sounds like you, hit subscribe. It genuinely helps more than you would think. Okay, let me take you back to the beginning of that shift. My name is Noelle, and at that point I had been at Fenwick's General for about 6 weeks. Fenwick's was one of those stores that did not fit neatly into a category, the kind of place that sold gardening tools next to greeting cards, next to a wall of phone chargers. A little bit of everything for a town that did not have anything bigger within 20 miles. I was not the newest hire on paper, but I was still the one everyone glanced at twice, the one who got the closing shifts nobody wanted, and the register nearest the door where the manager could keep an eye on things without seeming like she was keeping an eye on things. Before Fenwick's, I had spent almost 4 years working the intake counter at a shipping and freight company 2 towns over. The kind of job where you spend all day with boxes that other people packed, and you learn things about boxes that most people never think about. You learn what a box sounds like when it is packed correctly versus packed in a hurry. You learn what tape looks like when it has been applied once, calmly, by someone who does this every day versus applied twice, nervously, by someone covering something up. You learn that weight and size are supposed to agree with each other, and when they do not agree, there is almost always a reason. Nobody at Fenwick's knew any of that about me. To them, I was just the new girl who was decent enough at the register and quiet on her breaks. The manager on duty that day, and most days, was a woman named Carol Whitfield. Carol had been running that store for close to 17 years, and it showed in the way she moved through it, never rushed, never lost, like she had memorized the exact placement of every aisle so many times over that she could have walked it blind. Carol was not the kind of manager people complained about. She remembered the names of regular customers and their kids. She covered shifts herself when someone called in sick, rather than making the rest of us scramble. She had trained half the staff currently working there, including the assistant manager, and she still checked the returns desk herself most mornings, because she said, a store tells you the truth about itself through what people bring back. I want to be clear about Carol from the start, because what happened later was not about her being careless or cruel. Carol was, without question, one of the most reasonable people I had ever worked for. That matters for what comes next. The morning had started ordinary in every way. A morning can start ordinary. I clocked in at 9, took my spot at Register 4, and spent the first hour running through the usual mix of milk and light bulbs and birthday cards. Around 10:30, a delivery came in through the back, mostly restock for the hardware aisle, and Carol pulled 2 of us off the floor for 20 minutes to help unload it, which was normal for a Tuesday. I did not think about that delivery again until much later, when I realized it mattered more than I had given it credit for. It was a little after 1 in the afternoon when I first noticed the man. He came in through the front doors alone, wearing a jacket that was too heavy for the weather that day, and he moved through the store in a way that did not match anyone actually shopping. He did not check prices. He did not compare items. He walked with purpose toward the back corner near the seasonal aisle, the one place in the store with the least foot traffic, and, not coincidentally, no direct line of sight from the front registers. I only noticed him at all because I glanced up while bagging someone else's order and caught him standing very still near that corner for almost a full minute, not picking anything up, just standing there like he was waiting for something or someone. I want to say I had some immediate flash of certainty right then, some instinct that screamed at me, but that would not be honest. What I actually felt was smaller than that, more like an itch than an alarm. I finished the transaction I was working on and went back to my register and mostly forgot about him, the way you forget about 100 small oddities over the course of a normal shift, because most of them mean nothing. He came back into view about 40 minutes later, and this time he was not alone. He was walking beside another employee, a stock associate named Devin, who had only been there a few months longer than I had, and the two of them were carrying something between them from the back stockroom toward the front of the store. It was a box, mid-sized, plain brown, sealed with clear packing tape along every seam. Nothing about the box itself looked unusual from a distance. What looked unusual was the way Devin was carrying his side of it. He was holding it away from his body slightly, the way you hold something when you are not sure you want to be touching it, and he would not quite look at the man walking beside him. They set the box down near the front, not at any register, just off to the side near the coupon kiosk, and the man in the heavy jacket said something to Devin that I could not hear, and Devin nodded and walked away fast, back toward the stockroom, without looking at the box again. That was the second thing that caught my attention, though again, not enough to do anything about it. Employees moved boxes around that store constantly. There was nothing against the rules about a stock associate helping a customer carry something from the back, though it did strike me, even then, as slightly backward. Customers usually carried things they had picked up in the store, not things that had come out of the stockroom already packed and taped shut. The man left the box sitting by the kiosk and wandered the store for another 20 minutes or so, picking up a few unrelated items, a bag of batteries, a phone case, small things that any actual customer might buy, the kind of things that make a shopping trip look normal. Then, close to 2 in the afternoon, he came to my register with those small items and the sealed box. I scanned the batteries, I scanned the phone case, and then I picked up the box, and something about it stopped me before I even understood why. It was heavier than it should have been for its size, noticeably heavier, in a way that did not match anything Fenwick's typically sold in a box that shape. I have handled thousands of packages in my life between this job and my old one, enough that my hands register weight against size almost automatically, without me consciously doing the math. This box registered wrong the instant I lifted it toward the scanner. I set it back down, gently, and looked at the label. There was a printed shipping label on top, the kind our store used for items that came pre-packaged from a supplier rather than being boxed by us. But something about the label did not sit right either. The barcode was slightly crooked against the box, tilted just a few degrees off from how our label printer normally applied them, as if it had been peeled off one surface and pressed onto another. And underneath the tape, right along the seam closest to me, there was a faint discoloration in the cardboard, a kind of water stain or something close to it, old enough that it had dried into the fibers rather than sitting on the surface. The man was watching me, not glancing at me the way most customers glance at a cashier while waiting, but watching, steady, the way you watch someone when you are checking whether they have noticed something you need them not to notice. I looked up at him and then back down at the box, and I felt that itch from earlier turn into something heavier and colder, sitting low in my stomach. I did not know yet what was inside that box. I did not have a name for what was wrong with it. All I knew, standing there with my hand hovering an inch from the scanner, was that every small detail I had collected since 1 in the afternoon, the man loitering in the blind corner, Devin refusing to meet his eyes, the mismatched weight, the crooked label, the water stain hidden along the seam, had quietly stacked on top of each other into something I could not ignore anymore. My hand would not move. I did not scan the box. I set it down to the side of the belt instead, the way you might set down something that could spill, and I looked back up at the man and told him I needed just a moment to check on something before I could ring that item through. I kept my voice even, the same voice I used for pricing questions and coupon disputes, because I did not yet have a single fact I could point to, only a stack of small things that felt wrong in a way I could not have explained to anyone standing there watching me. The man did not get angry, not at first, which in its own way told me something. He said that was fine, that he was not in a hurry, and he stepped back from the counter to let the woman behind him step forward with her own items, the same woman who would later be tapping her card against the counter in frustration, though at that point she was still calm, still just waiting her turn. I rang her through quickly, my hands moving on their own, while the rest of my attention stayed fixed on that box sitting to the side of my register, heavy in a way it had no right to be. I want to explain something about how those old instincts work, because it is not magic, and it is not some sixth sense, no matter how it might have looked to the people standing in that line later. When you spend years handling packages the way I did at my old freight job, your brain builds a kind of internal chart without you ever deciding to build it. Box this size, this shape, this material should weigh somewhere in this range. When something comes in outside that range, your hands know before your mind catches up. It is the same thing a mechanic feels when an engine sounds almost right, but not quite, or the same thing a nurse feels when a patient looks almost fine, but something in their color is off. It is pattern recognition built from repetition, not a hunch pulled out of nowhere. But knowing that about myself did not help me explain it to anyone else in that moment, and it certainly would not help me explain it to Carol. I glanced toward the stockroom doorway, half hoping to catch Devin again, but he did not come back out to the floor. I thought about paging him, asking him directly what that box was and where it had come from, but something told me that if the man in the heavy jacket heard Devin's name called over the store intercom in connection with that box, whatever was happening would simply pause and reset itself for another day, another cashier, someone less likely to notice. I did not have a plan yet. I only had the growing certainty that I was standing in the middle of something that had already been arranged before I ever touched that box, and that the arranging had been careful. I looked at the label again while pretending to search for a price on my screen. Fenwick's used 2 different kinds of labels, depending on how an item entered inventory. Items we boxed ourselves at the customer service counter for online order pickups or special requests got a label printed fresh at that counter with our store logo centered at the top and a barcode printed flush and straight beneath it. Items that arrived from suppliers already packaged, which we simply logged into inventory and put on the shelf, kept whatever label the supplier had applied, which looked different, more generic, without our logo at all. This label had our store logo on it, but the barcode beneath the logo sat crooked, tilted just enough that I doubted it would scan cleanly even if I tried, angled in a way that a label printed flush against a flat box surface simply would not produce on its own. Labels come out of our printer already straight. They do not shift after printing unless somebody peels them off one surface and presses them onto another, and even then, peeling and repositioning a label usually leaves faint creasing or bubbling in the paper, which, when I leaned in close enough to look, without looking like I was looking, I could see faintly along one edge. Someone had taken a label meant for something else and moved it onto this box. The weight problem nagged at me the whole time I was ringing up the man's batteries and phone case. Boxes that size, when we packaged small electronics or household goods for pickup orders, typically weighed somewhere in a range my arms had long since memorized without needing a number attached to it. This one sat heavier by what felt like several pounds too many, dense in a way that suggested whatever filled it was not loosely packed, foam or bubble wrap around a small item, but something solid, something that filled the space almost completely. I thought about the water stain along the seam next. Water stains on cardboard do not appear overnight. They come from boxes that have sat somewhere damp for an extended stretch. A garage, a storage unit, the back of a vehicle during a rainy week, long enough for moisture to work its way into the fibers and dry there permanently, leaving that yellow-brown tinge that never fully goes away, even once the box dries out completely. Fenwick's stockroom was climate-controlled and dry, always had been, which was one of the things Carol took a strange amount of pride in, since she had fought the corporate office for 2 years to get the dehumidifier system installed after a mold scare back before I started working there. A box coming fresh out of that stockroom should never have carried a stain like that, which meant, as far as I could tell, that this box had not started its life in that stockroom at all. It had come from somewhere else and had been brought into the building recently, and someone had wanted it to look like ordinary store stock. By now, the man had paid for his batteries and phone case separately, in cash, which was itself a small detail worth noticing, since most customers paying under $10 used a card without thinking twice. And he was standing there watching me with an expression that had shifted from patient to something closer to expectant, waiting for me to finish whatever I was doing and simply scan the box like every other item that day. I need to explain something to you watching this, something I think about a great deal even now. In this moment, I did not know what was inside that box. I had no name for it, no proof. Nothing beyond a collection of small physical details that, taken individually, could each be explained away easily enough. A crooked label could be an accident. A heavy box could just be heavy. A water stain could have come from anywhere, at any point in the box's life before it ever reached our store. Any single one of those things, on its own, would not have stopped me for even a second. It was the way they all stacked together, all at once, on a box that a man had specifically waited near an empty corner of the store to receive from a stock associate who would not meet his eyes. That made something in me refuse to move my hand toward that scanner. I picked the box up one more time, cradling it against my stomach, the way you might hold something you are trying to weigh with your whole body instead of just your hands. And I felt it shift very slightly inside, not the loose rattle of small items settling, but a single, dense, controlled shift, like something solid sliding an inch and then stopping. That was the moment the itch in my stomach turned into something I can only describe as certainty, even though certainty is a strange word to use for something I could not have written down as a fact on any piece of paper. I set the box down again, more carefully this time, and I told the man I was sorry for the delay, that I just needed to verify something with a manager before completing the sale. His jaw tightened, just barely, a small flicker, before his expression smoothed back over into patience. He said that seemed unnecessary for a box he had already paid for once through a different transaction, and that comment stopped me cold, because nothing about this box had been rung up anywhere yet, not on my register, not that I had seen. I did not correct him out loud. I simply nodded, said I would only be a moment, and stepped away from my register toward the customer service counter, where I knew I could find the store phone and page Carol directly, rather than over the general intercom. While I was walking those 20 feet, my mind was doing the thing minds do when they are trying to build a bridge between a feeling and a fact, trying to construct some plausible, ordinary explanation for everything I had just noticed, because some quiet part of me still wanted to be wrong. Maybe the box was a return that had not been processed correctly. Maybe Devin had grabbed the wrong item off a shelf. Maybe the water stain was old and irrelevant, and I was building a story out of nothing more than coincidence stacked on coincidence. But every explanation I tried to construct fell apart against one detail or another, and by the time I reached the phone, I had stopped trying to talk myself out of what I already believed. I paged Carol to the front, keeping my voice as level and ordinary as I could manage, the same tone I would use to ask her a question about a coupon policy, because I did not want the man standing at register 4 to hear anything in my voice that would tell him I already knew something was badly wrong. Carol arrived within a couple of minutes, coming from the office in the back where she had been going over the afternoon delivery paperwork, and I intercepted her before she reached the front, pulling her a few steps aside near the end cap of greeting cards, out of the man's direct line of sight. I told her, as quickly and clearly as I could, that I did not think we should sell the sealed box currently sitting at my register. I told her about the weight, the crooked label, the water stain along the seam, the way Devin had carried it and would not look at the customer, the empty corner where the man had waited before the box ever appeared. Carol listened to all of it with the same steady, patient expression she gave everyone, the expression of someone who had heard a great many concerns from a great many employees over 17 years, and had learned to take each one seriously without immediately assuming the worst. When I finished, she asked me the one question I did not have a good answer for. She asked me what exactly I thought was inside the box, and I had to tell her the truth, which was that I did not know. I only knew with a certainty I could feel in my chest and could not translate into anything resembling proof that whatever was inside it, it was not something that belonged on a receipt at Register 4, and it was not something that should leave that building in the next 5 minutes. Carol did not dismiss what I told her, but she did not immediately act on it either, and looking back, I understand completely why. 17 years of running that store had taught her that every single day someone comes to her with a concern that feels enormous in the moment and turns out to be nothing, a return that looks suspicious but has a boring explanation, a customer who seems off but is just having a hard day. Her job depended on being able to tell the difference between genuine problems and ordinary anxiety, and from where she was standing, everything I had given her sounded like the second kind. A heavy box, a slightly crooked label, a water stain that could have come from anywhere, a stock associate who seemed uncomfortable, which, as she gently pointed out, described Devin on a fairly regular basis, regardless of what he was carrying, since he was young and still a little awkward with customers in general. She asked if I had actually seen anything illegal, anything dangerous, anything at all beyond a feeling that something was wrong. I said no. She asked if the customer had done or said anything threatening. I said no, not exactly. Only that one strange comment about the box already being paid for through a different transaction, and even as I repeated it back to her, I could hear how thin it sounded out loud, how easily it could be a customer misspeaking, mixing up which item he meant. Carol was not unkind about any of this. She put a hand on my shoulder and told me she understood that 6 weeks into a new job, everything can still feel unfamiliar enough to seem suspicious, that stores like ours moved strange, mismatched inventory around constantly, damaged returns, mislabeled supplier stock, items transferred in from other locations, with paperwork that never quite matched what showed up. She told me she would go check the receiving log herself right then to see if there was a record of that box coming in through any official channel, and if there was nothing, she would sort it out from there. She asked me to go back to my register in the meantime and simply hold off on scanning it until she got back. That felt, for a moment, like enough. I walked back to Register 4, where the man was still waiting, now joined by 2 more customers behind him in a line that was beginning to stretch further than it should have for 2 in the afternoon on a weekday. I told him my manager was checking on something and would only be another minute or 2, and he nodded, though I noticed his eyes moving past me toward the back of the store where Carol had disappeared, tracking her the way you track someone whose actions might matter to you. The wait stretched longer than either of us expected. Customers behind him started shifting their weight, checking their phones, glancing toward the other open register where a coworker named Priya was ringing people through at a normal pace. I felt the particular kind of pressure that builds when you are the reason a line is not moving, when strangers are looking at you and forming quiet judgments about your competence. And I want to be honest that a part of me, a tired, embarrassed part, wanted to just scan the box and make the discomfort stop. That part of me was loud. It would have been so easy to let it win. But every time I looked down at that box sitting beside my register, the weight of it, the tilt of that label, the memory of that single, dense shift I had felt when I lifted it, pulled me back from that easier choice. Carol came back sooner than I expected, though it did not feel that way standing at the register with a line growing behind me. She did not come straight to me. She went first to the customer service desk and picked up the store phone, and I watched her dial a number and speak quietly for close to a minute, her back partly turned, her posture straightening the way people's posture straightens when a conversation shifts from casual to serious. When she hung up, she came over to me, and her expression had changed. It was not alarmed exactly. Carol did not really do alarmed, but it was more focused, more careful than it had been a few minutes earlier. She told me, quietly, that there was no record of that box in the receiving log for the day. Not under any transfer number, not under any supplier order, nothing. She said the only delivery that had come in that morning was the restock we had all helped unload, hardware items, nothing boxed the way this one was. She said she had also tried reaching Devin on his cell rather than paging him over the intercom, since she did not want to draw attention to it, and he had not picked up. For just a second, I thought this meant she believed me completely, that we were now on the same side of this. But Carol was still Carol, still someone who needed more than an unexplained gap in a log before she was willing to treat a paying customer like a suspect in the middle of her store in front of a dozen witnesses based on nothing more than a missing paper trail that could just as easily be a filing mistake from an overworked receiving clerk. She told me the most likely explanation, the one she had seen play out a handful of times over the years, was that this was some kind of employee mistake, maybe Devin or someone else improperly boxing a damaged return or an item that should never have left the back room, and that the actual solution was simple. Pull the box aside, apologize to the customer, offer to have it looked into, and if it turned out to be a genuine item, have it reprocessed properly rather than sold at full price under whatever confused circumstances had led it to my register in the first place. That should have been the end of it. That should have been a reasonable, fair resolution that let both of us walk away without anyone losing anything. And if Carol had simply pulled the box aside and told the customer we could not sell it today, I believe that would have been that. But the man did not accept it quietly. When Carol turned to him and explained, gently but clearly, that there appeared to be a discrepancy with this particular item and that we could not complete the sale today, but that she would be glad to look into it and have someone contact him once it was resolved, his entire demeanor shifted in a way that told me, more than anything else that day, that my instincts had been right from the very beginning. He did not ask reasonable follow-up questions. He did not offer to show a receipt or explain where the box had come from. Instead, his voice rose, sharp and fast, insisting that he had already arranged for this item, that it was already his, that we had no right to simply refuse to hand over something he had come specifically to collect. He said the word arranged twice, and both times it landed heavier than anything else he had said, because customers do not typically use that word for something they picked up off a shelf. That rising volume drew attention from every direction. The line behind him, Priya at the next register, a couple browsing the greeting card aisle who both turned to look. Carol, to her enormous credit, did not raise her voice back at him even slightly. She kept her tone level and told him she understood his frustration, that she was not accusing him of anything, only that store policy required her to resolve the discrepancy before completing any sale, and that this was for his protection as much as ours, since none of us wanted to sell him something that later turned out to be defective, damaged, or improperly logged. He stared at her for a long moment, and then he did something that, more than anything he had said, told me exactly how much that box mattered to him. He turned and walked out of the store, fast, without the box, without his batteries or his phone case sitting in the bag by the register, without another word. The line let out a kind of collective exhale, the tension breaking into confused murmuring, and for a few seconds I actually thought this was over, that the strange, tense hour I had just lived through would simply end there, with an angry customer walking out and a sealed box left behind for someone to sort out later at leisure. That relief lasted less than a minute. Carol picked up the box herself, intending, she told me later, to carry it straight back to the office and open it properly with a witness present, exactly the kind of careful, reasonable step you would expect from someone who took her responsibility seriously, even when she was skeptical of the underlying concern. But as she lifted it, the same dense, controlled shift I had felt earlier happened again, more noticeably this time, since she was holding it with both hands rather than balanced against a hip, and I watched her face change, watched 17 years of composure flicker for just a second into something closer to the same unease I had been carrying for the last hour. She set the box down on the counter, and for the first time all afternoon, she looked directly at me instead of past me, and she asked, quietly enough that only I could hear it, whether I was still absolutely sure about this. I told her I was. I could not explain why, could not point to a single fact that would hold up if she asked me to write it down and sign it, but every part of me that had spent years handling packages, weighing boxes without thinking, reading labels without meaning to, was telling me the same thing. It had been telling me since 1 in the afternoon, and I was not willing to pretend otherwise just because it would have been easier. I want to pause the story right here, because I think this is the moment worth asking yourself about more than any other part of what happened that day. Not whether you would have scanned the box or refused it, but whether you have ever stood exactly where Carol was standing right then, holding something heavier than it should be, looking at someone who cannot fully explain why they are so certain, and having to decide in the next 30 seconds whether their certainty is worth trusting. Tell me in the comments which side of that moment you think you would have been on, the one refusing to scan it or the one holding the box, trying to decide whether to believe her. Carol set the box down, took a slow breath, and reached for the phone at the customer service desk again, this time not to call the receiving department, but to dial the direct line for the county sheriff's non-emergency dispatch, the number she had posted on a small card taped inside the desk drawer since before I had ever started working there. That was when the man came back through the front doors, and he was not alone. He came back through the front doors with another man beside him, younger, broader through the shoulders, wearing a delivery company polo shirt that did not quite match the rest of his appearance, since the pants and shoes underneath it were nothing like what any actual delivery driver at that company wore on shift. The first man pointed toward Register 4 almost before the doors had finished sliding shut behind them, and the two of them crossed the store fast, weaving between an end cap and a cart someone had left near the pharmacy aisle, moving with the kind of urgency that told everyone watching this was not a calm continuation of an earlier misunderstanding. Carol was still holding the phone against her ear, waiting for dispatch to pick up, when the two men reached the counter. The younger one reached for the box on the counter without asking, without a word to either of us, the same casual entitlement his companion had shown earlier, as though the box belonged to him by simple virtue of him wanting it. Carol stepped between him and the counter before his hand closed around it, not shouting, not even raising her voice much above where it had been all afternoon, but placing her body and her presence firmly enough that he stopped, surprised, the way people are often surprised when a woman in her 50s who runs a general store refuses to move out of the way. She told him evenly that she had a sheriff's deputy on the line and that whatever he believed belonged to him could be sorted out through the proper channel once someone in uniform was standing there to sort it, and that in the meantime nobody was leaving the store with that box. The first man started talking fast then, a stream of words about how this was a misunderstanding, how they had somewhere to be, how none of this needed to involve anyone official, his voice climbing in pitch in a way that had nothing to do with genuine confusion and everything to do with someone watching a plan come apart faster than he could patch it. I stayed at my register through all of this, close enough to hear everything, but not foolish enough to insert myself physically into whatever was happening in front of the customer service desk. What I did instead was quietly step to the side and pick up the second store phone, the one at my own register, and dial the direct line to the back office where I knew our assistant manager, a soft-spoken man named Raymond, would be finishing paperwork from the morning delivery. I told him, as calmly as I could manage, with my heart hammering, in a way I had not let myself acknowledge until that exact moment, that he needed to come to the front immediately, and that if he happened to still have Devon's personnel file open on his desk from onboarding, he should bring the emergency contact number listed on it, because I had a feeling, one more piece of instinct stacked on everything else, that Devon might not simply be avoiding his phone by accident. By the time I hung up, the situation at the front had not calmed down. It had escalated in a different direction. The younger man in the mismatched delivery polo had backed up half a step from Carol, but the first man had shifted his focus toward the box itself, staring at it on the counter with an intensity that made something in my chest go tight and cold. The particular look of someone calculating whether a single fast movement could still get him what he wanted before anyone stopped him. That was the moment the line of waiting customers, 11 people deep by then, went completely silent, every single one of them watching a scene that had stopped resembling an ordinary shopping trip several minutes earlier. Carol, still holding that phone against her shoulder, finally got through to dispatch, and I heard her give our store address in a voice that did not shake even slightly, followed by a short, precise description of 2 men attempting to remove an unclaimed package from the premises under circumstances she believed warranted a welfare check, deliberately choosing language that sounded procedural rather than accusatory, the kind of careful phrasing that told me she had learned, over 17 years, exactly how to describe a situation to law enforcement in a way that would get a fast response without inflaming whatever was happening in front of her in real time. The first man heard enough of that call to understand exactly what it meant, and something in his posture changed, the aggressive edge draining out of it and replaced by something closer to resignation mixed with barely restrained anger. He said, quietly now, almost to himself, that this had all just been a stupid misunderstanding, that they would come back another time when things were sorted out properly, and he turned toward the door, pulling the younger man with him by the sleeve of that mismatched polo shirt. Carol told him, still holding the phone, that dispatch had already logged the call, and that leaving now would not change that a deputy was on the way. And for a moment, I thought he might actually turn back. He did not. Both men pushed through the front doors and crossed the parking lot fast, and through the front windows, I watched them get into a gray sedan, parked at an angle across 2 spaces near the edge of the lot, not near the front where customers normally parked, but toward the back corner, near the loading area, close enough to the stockroom's exterior door that it could not have been a coincidence. The sedan pulled out of the lot before the flashing lights of a sheriff's cruiser turned into the entrance 11 minutes later, and I remember watching those 2 vehicles pass each other on the road just outside, so close in time and so far apart in outcome, and feeling something twist in my stomach that had nothing to do with the box anymore, and everything to do with how close all of this had come to simply working. If I had scanned that box the way I was supposed to, the way any reasonable, unsuspicious cashier would have on any ordinary day. Raymond arrived at the front of the store about 90 seconds after the men left, slightly out of breath, holding a manila folder against his chest, and it was the look on his face, more than anything he said, that told me my instinct about Devin had not been wrong either. He said Devin's emergency contact number, listed under his mother, had gone straight to a voicemail that was already full, and that, when he had tried Devin's cell phone one more time on his way to the front, it had rung twice and then gone dead, not to voicemail, but the specific kind of abrupt silence that happens when a call is actively declined rather than simply unanswered. The deputy who walked through the front doors a few minutes later was a heavy-set man in his 40s, named Deputy Osei, and Carol met him at the entrance and spoke to him quietly for a couple of minutes before bringing him over to the counter where the box still sat, exactly where she had set it down, untouched since the 2 men had left. I want to be honest that in that stretch of waiting, standing at my register with a line of customers still watching, half of them now whispering to each other about what they had just witnessed, I felt the full weight of what I had done settle onto me for the first time. I had refused a direct instruction from my manager in front of every single one of those customers, based on nothing more than the memorized feel of package weight and a slightly crooked label, and if that box turned out to contain nothing more than a poorly labeled electronics return, I understood I would look to every person in that store and to Carol herself exactly like someone who had lost her mind in public for no reason at all. Deputy Osei asked Carol a series of questions I could half hear from where I stood, about the timeline, about who had brought the box to the front, about whether store cameras covered the area near the seasonal aisle where the man had first waited. Carol answered each question clearly and without hesitation, the same steady competence she brought to everything, and then she turned and gestured for me to come over, telling the deputy that I was the one who had first flagged the box and could speak to the specific details that had concerned me. I walked over on legs that did not feel entirely like my own, and I told Deputy Osei everything I had told Carol earlier, the weight, the label, the water stain, the way Devin had carried it, the empty corner where the man had waited, the strange comment about the box already being paid for through a different transaction. He listened the way Carol had listened, patiently, without interrupting, writing occasional notes in a small notebook, and when I finished, he did not immediately tell me whether any of it made sense to him. Instead, he asked whether anyone had opened the box yet. Nobody had. It had sat on that counter, sealed, through the entire confrontation, through the men leaving, through the 11-minute wait for a deputy to arrive, still taped shut exactly as it had been since Devin carried it out of the stockroom hours earlier. Deputy Osei pulled a pair of gloves from a pouch on his belt and asked Carol for permission to open it there at the counter, given that it was, as far as anyone could establish, unclaimed store property with no valid record of purchase or transfer. Carol nodded, and I watched her hands, steady through everything else that afternoon, tighten slightly around the edge of the counter as he reached for the seam along the top. The tape gave way easily under his knife, the same seam I had noticed the discoloration along earlier, and as the flaps of the box came open, I realized I had been holding my breath since the moment he picked up that knife, waiting to find out, after everything, whether the last several hours of my life were about to be validated or completely, humiliatingly undone in front of everyone still standing in that line. Deputy Osei folded back the top flaps of the box, and for a moment, nobody at that counter said anything at all. Inside, nestled in gray foam cut precisely to its shape, sat a firearm, a handgun with the serial number visibly filed down along the metal near the grip, the scratches still bright and fresh against the darker finish around them, the kind of fresh that told you the filing had happened recently, not years ago. Underneath it, tucked into a second molded section of the same foam, sat a second, smaller handgun, and beneath that, folded flat, a thin stack of paper that turned out, once Deputy Osei carefully lifted it free with his gloved hands, to be photocopies of identification documents, 3 different names, 3 different faces, none of which matched the man who had stood at my register less than an hour earlier. I remember the sound of the store in that moment more than I remember my own thoughts, the low collective murmur that moved through the line of waiting customers as word of what was in the box passed backward, person to person, someone near the front describing it in a whisper to the person behind them, that whisper repeating itself all the way to the back of the line within maybe 10 seconds. Priya, still running her own register a few feet away, had stopped scanning items entirely, standing with the customer's bag of chips still in her hand, watching. Carol did not say anything for what felt like a long stretch of time, though it was probably only 5 or 6 seconds. When she finally spoke, she did not look at the box. She looked at me, and what she said was simple, quiet, almost private, despite everyone standing around us. She said she was sorry, and she said it in a way that told me she meant it completely, not as a formality, but as an actual acknowledgement that she had made me stand there and defend myself, that she had nearly let that box leave the building in the hands of two men who very clearly had no legitimate claim to it, and that the only reason none of that had happened was because I had refused to let it go, over and over, past the point where refusing was easy or comfortable or even reasonable to anyone but me. Deputy Osei was already on his radio by then, requesting backup and giving a description of the gray sedan and the two men, along with the direction they had driven when they left the lot. He asked Carol for access to the store security footage covering the seasonal aisle and the loading area near the stockroom door, and Carol handed that responsibility straight to Raymond, who disappeared into the back office to pull it up. It was another 20 minutes or so before anyone thought to ask the question that had been sitting underneath everything since the moment the men left the store, which was where exactly Devin was, and whether he was safe. Raymond came back out from reviewing the footage with his face pale in a way I had not seen on him before, and he told Carol quietly, though not quietly enough that I did not catch most of it, that the stockroom camera near the back exterior door showed Devin meeting the first man there earlier that morning, well before the box ever appeared on my register, the two of them talking for close to 4 minutes before Devin went back inside alone. Deputy Osei asked to see that footage himself, and after watching it, he asked Carol whether Devin had a personnel record with a home address on file, since dispatch had not been able to reach him by phone, and, given everything found in that box, he wanted a patrol unit to check on him directly rather than simply wait for him to resurface on his own. I want to pause here and say something honest about how I felt in that stretch of time, because it would be easy, telling this story after the fact, to make myself sound entirely steady and certain the whole way through, some kind of quiet hero who never doubted herself once. That would not be true. Once the box was open, once the guns and the false identification documents were sitting there in plain sight on the counter, undeniable, I felt a wave of relief so overwhelming it nearly buckled my knees, followed almost immediately by a second wave of something closer to horror, because until that exact moment, some very quiet part of me had genuinely believed there was a real chance I had just destroyed my job, my reputation, and Carol's trust in me over a box of poorly labeled electronics. Being right did not erase how frightening it had felt to not know, for that entire stretch of hours, whether I actually was. Carol asked Raymond to pull Devin's file, and within a few minutes, a deputy from a second patrol car, the backup Deputy Osei had called in, was dispatched to the address on file, a small rented house about 15 minutes from the store that Devin shared with 2 roommates. I did not learn what happened at that address until later that evening, after my shift, technically, had already ended, since Carol asked me to stay while everything with the deputies was sorted out, and I did not mind staying at all, because leaving in the middle of it would have felt impossible. What the second deputy found at that address, and what came out over the following 2 days as the investigation moved forward, was that Devin had gotten into debt with someone several months earlier, a small amount at first that had grown considerably through interest and pressure, the kind of debt that starts as an emergency loan between acquaintances and slowly turns into something closer to leverage. The man who had walked into our store that day was connected to whoever held that debt, and the arrangement, as it was eventually pieced together by investigators, involved using Devin's access to the stockroom and his familiarity with our store's labeling and shipping systems to move firearms through Fenwick's as an intermediate stop, disguised as ordinary retail stock, before they continued on to wherever they were ultimately headed. The store itself, its ordinary appearance, its steady flow of customers, its shelves full of nothing more dangerous than gardening tools and phone chargers, was exactly the kind of place nobody would think to look twice at a sealed box moving through it. Devin was not home when the second deputy arrived, and it took almost 36 hours before anyone located him, staying with a cousin 2 counties over, frightened enough by how quickly everything had unraveled at the store that he had left before his shift even officially ended, taking almost nothing with him. When investigators finally spoke with him, he described exactly the kind of situation that made the whole thing almost unbearably sad rather than purely infuriating. A young man in over his head with people who had made it very clear, in ways he was too afraid to describe specifically to police at first, that failing to help them would cost him considerably more than his job. I did not learn any of these details that same afternoon, standing at Register 4. What I learned that afternoon was smaller and more immediate, which was that Carol, once Deputy Osei had finished his initial statement taking, and the box had been carefully sealed into an evidence bag rather than a shopping bag, turned to me in front of everyone still lingering near the front of the store, including several customers who had never actually made it through the line to check out, and said clearly enough for all of them to hear that I still had a job at Fenwick's General, that firing me earlier had been a mistake made under pressure and incomplete information, and that she wanted that correction on the record in front of the same people who had watched her make the original decision. I want to be honest about something here too, something that surprised me even as it was happening. I did not feel triumphant in that moment. I did not feel like I had won some argument or proven a point. What I felt mostly was tired and grateful, and something close to sympathy for Carol, standing there having to walk back a decision she had made for entirely reasonable reasons, in front of an audience, because the truth had turned out to be far stranger and far more serious than anything either of us could have expected walking into that shift. Deputy Osei finished taking statements from both Carol and me a little after 4 in the afternoon, nearly 2 full hours after that box had first landed on my register belt. Before he left, he told me something I have thought about many times since, which was that, in his experience, the details that end up mattering most in cases like this are rarely dramatic on their own. They are small, easy to dismiss, easy to explain away individually, and the only reason they add up to anything is when someone refuses to stop noticing them one at a time until they form a whole picture. He said most people talk themselves out of that noticing long before it becomes useful, because it is uncomfortable and inconvenient, and almost always easier to simply do the job in front of you and move on. The store stayed open the rest of that day, though the mood on the floor for the remainder of my shift was unlike anything I had experienced there before. Customers lingering near the front longer than usual, coworkers finding excuses to walk past Register 4 just to glance at the spot where the box had sat. Priya finally coming over on her own break to ask me, quietly, how I had known. A question I still did not have a clean, satisfying answer for, even with the box already opened and everything inside it confirmed. I told Priya more or less what I am telling you now, that I had not known, not in the way people usually mean when they use that word, not with any single fact I could point to and say this is the piece of evidence that gave it away. What I had was a stack of small physical details that individually meant nothing and collectively meant everything. And the only reason I trusted that stack enough to risk my job over it was because I had spent 4 years of my life learning, without ever meaning to, what boxes are supposed to feel like when nothing is wrong with them. Priya nodded slowly, and I could tell she was turning the same question over that I had been turning over in my own head since Deputy Osei took his notebook and walked back out to his cruiser, which was how many other boxes at how many other stores moved through exactly the same way, unnoticed, because the person standing at that register did not happen to have 4 years of freight handling behind them. Carol asked me to stay a few minutes after my shift technically ended, not for anything disciplinary, but because she wanted to talk without a line of customers standing nearby, listening. We sat in the small break room in the back, at the same round table where I usually ate my lunch alone, and she poured us both coffee from the pot that had been sitting there since morning and had gone slightly bitter, the way break room coffee always does by mid-afternoon. She told me she had been running that store long enough to develop her own instincts about people and situations. Instincts she trusted the same way I trusted mine about boxes, and that everything about the situation at my register that day had genuinely read to her as the more common and far less serious explanation: a slightly anxious new employee, a missing paperwork trail that was probably just a filing error, a customer who was frustrated but not dangerous. She said she had made the call she made because it was the reasonable call, the one almost anyone in her position would have made with the same information in front of them, and she wanted me to understand that even now, even knowing everything that had turned out to be true, she did not think that reasoning itself had been wrong. What had been wrong was not trusting that my instincts might be reading something hers could not, simply because mine came from a place she had no way of seeing. I told her I understood completely, and I meant it. I never once believed, that day or afterward, that Carol had done anything except exactly what any careful, fair manager would have done with the information available to her in the moment. That was, in its own way, the hardest part of the whole afternoon to sit with, harder even than the fear of losing my job. It would have been so much simpler if she had been careless or dismissive, if I could have walked away from that day telling a clean story about someone who refused to listen. Instead, I walked away from it with a much more complicated understanding that two people can look at the exact same set of facts, both act in complete good faith, and still land in entirely different places, and that being right in the end does not automatically mean the other person was wrong to doubt you in the beginning. Fenwick's General reopened for a normal Wednesday morning the next day. Though normal did not quite feel like the right word for a while, Devin did not come back to work there again, not because he was formally fired, since Carol told me later that the situation with him was handled quietly through the ongoing investigation rather than through store policy, and she never shared the exact details of what happened to him afterward, only that he had cooperated fully once he was located, and that the people who had pressured him into it were the ones investigators were ultimately far more interested in than a scared 22-year-old stock associate who had made one very bad decision under circumstances that were, by every account, genuinely frightening for him. The man from Register 4, along with the younger man in the mismatched delivery polo, were both identified within the week through the gray sedan, which had been registered under a name connected to an investigation already underway in a neighboring county involving a pattern of firearms being moved through small independent retailers, exactly the way ours had almost been used. I never learned every detail of what happened to either of them afterward, and honestly, I did not go looking for those details the way I might have expected myself to. Once the box was open, and the truth of it was sitting there in an evidence bag, most of my urgency about the situation quietly resolved itself, and what was left behind was something closer to exhaustion than curiosity. What stayed with me longer than any of that was something smaller, and it happened about 4 days later, on a Saturday afternoon. Carol found me stocking greeting cards, the same aisle Devin had walked past 100 times, and she handed me a small laminated card. the same kind of card taped inside the customer service desk drawer, with the sheriff's non-emergency number on it, except this one had something else written on the back in her own handwriting, a note asking me, the next time something at that register felt wrong in a way I could not fully explain, to come find her directly rather than going through Raymond or anyone else on shift, because she wanted to be the one who listened next time personally, without a line of customers making either of us feel rushed into a decision. I kept that card in my apron pocket for the rest of the time I worked at Fenwick's, and I still have it now, tucked into a drawer at home, a little worn at the corners from being carried around in a pocket for months. It is not a dramatic object. It does not look like anything if you found it without knowing the story behind it. Just a laminated rectangle with a phone number on one side and 11 words in ballpoint pen on the other. But every time I come across it, I think about that stretch of time at Register 4, my hand refusing to move toward the scanner, 11 people standing behind that customer, watching a cashier they had never met make a decision none of them understood yet. And I think about how close that box came to simply passing through, unnoticed, the way it was designed to. If you have made it this far with me through this whole story, I want to thank you genuinely for sticking with it and for sticking with this channel through everything I have shared here over these last several weeks. Every story I put up here is about the same basic thing, an ordinary person who noticed something nobody else could see yet and who had to decide, with no guarantee of being believed, whether that noticing was worth acting on anyway. I do not know what version of that moment you might be carrying right now. Something at your own job, something in your own life that feels small and inconvenient and easy to dismiss. But I hope this one gave you a little more reason to trust it when it happens. If it did, stick around, because there are more stories like this coming every week, and I would genuinely love to have you here for them. Carol still runs Fenwick's General. I still work Register 4 most days, though these days, when something about a box does not sit quite right in my hands, I do not wait as long to say so out loud.